Scavengers of the seven seas, salty dogs who sailed in search of plunder and glory. There is perhaps no other figure in pop culture quite as intriguing as pirates. Hello everyone and welcome back to Desks and Dorks. I am Kyle, I am the dork. A couple things, if you really want to help us out, all of the YouTube pleasantries, if you feel that we deserve them, go a long way. Single best way to help us out though is by purchasing our games. You can get them from physical description, or the description's the link below if you want physical copies, or of course you can go to itch.io and follow that QR code and you can get digital copies there. If I sound excited, it's because I am. I freaking love pirates. I don't think I'm alone in that either. There is something so magical about these wonderful little swashbucklers. And this video, if you can't tell by the runtime and the general length, is going to be a doozy. I really cooked with this one, but before we get started, a couple things. One, we're going to cover a general history on Primer, misconceptions about pirates, just some cool stuff that I thought was interesting, and finally, variant rules and concepts to help you integrate pirates into your games. However, I do have to mention, I was trained as a historian. It's what my college degree was in, not something I practiced, but I was a Eurocentric historian, a Eurocentric medievalist to be specific, and this video is going to incorporate a lot about piracy in the world, which means I'm kind of stepping above and beyond my ballywick, so to speak. So, again, I try my absolute darndest with the research, but I might make some mistakes because I'm actually venturing into areas where I don't generally have the sort of nuance and expertise that I usually do. And two, pirates did, and we're going to talk about some pretty heinous stuff that they, accomplished during their time on the high seas. If you're going to put those into your games, please make sure you're using safety tools. Just check up on your players, make sure everybody is okay before you spring something on them. Cool? Cool, let's talk about pirates! But before we get started, we have to establish why is it so difficult to find the real historical pirate? And I think this has one big culprit, and that, my dear friends, is pop culture. You see, it is really impossible for us to sort of dissect the pirate without first dealing with the massive Jack Sparrow-sized elephant in the room. Piracy and the pirates in the golden age of piracy that we're going to be discussing today were so interesting to modern pop culture that it is impossible for us to dissect them or observe them without having to confront a lot of those cultural stereotypes. Whether we're talking about movies, of course, like Pirates of the Caribbean, or even like stage plays like the Pirates of Penzance, to games like Assassin's Creed Black Flag, it's really impossible for us to engage in good historical scholarship about pirates without first having to confront the pop cultural nuance and the pop cultural elephant in the room. We have to mention that this is the main reason it's so hard for us to find historically accurate information about pirates, or to challenge our pop cultural misconceptions about those things. I'm not going up against like one thing, I am going up against, in many cases, several hundred years worth of pop culturalization. Something we take for granted is that pirates were being mythologized during the time that there were pirates, as they became the subject of penny dreadfuls and stories. Fabricated tales of pirates and their adventures or misadventures were common during the age of piracy. So there is a lot, and I do mean a lot, of mythologizing that goes on with these lovely little swashbucklers. And ultimately, I think that has to do with the things that being a pirate brings: freedom, equality, and opportunity. At the time that piracy was being practiced, it was very difficult to make your way as a common man. And although certain places, cough cough, the United States, espoused this sort of egalitarian dream that anybody could be anything, the reality was often not the case. But for the most part, one of the tropes of piracy and pirates in popular media that is correct historically is that anybody from any walk of life, as long as you had a skill with sailing and fighting and a disregard for human life, your own and others, you could make a way as a buccaneer. Now, this is especially true if you were from historically marginalized groups. Women made up quite a few different pirates. People of color made up quite a few different pirates. And those people would have been traditionally denied certain opportunities and certain paths forward in the Western world. And they found them in piracy. It is really not hard for us to imagine that the golden age of piracy offered these opportunities, and freedom, equality, and opportunity are intoxicating and intriguing concepts for stories. Well, when we're going to be talking about our pirates, we're going to be talking specifically about the golden age of piracy. For those of you not in the know, that's mid-1600 to early 1700. There is some debate among scholars and historians about when exactly the quote-unquote golden age of piracy is, but almost everybody agrees it's mid-1600 to about early 1700. Some people are like, it starts in 1630, some say it starts in 1650. We're just going to call it the mid-1600s to the early 1700s, and we're going to go on from there. Cool? Cool. Well, let's keep going then, shall we? Now, it's important for us to discuss the causes of piracy and what made this particular time period so ripe for pirates. And the first one is warfare. At the time, every single European power was building up a maritime and naval force to duke it out with each other for profit and control of the new world. You had the established powers like the British Royal Navy or the French Royal Navy. You, of course, had the Spaniards, and you had the Dutch, all duking it out for massive, massive territorial gains and important, vastly important sums of land and wealth. However, as exciting as it is for us to imagine these great galleons, these ships of the line, duking it out and battling, I'll be honest, a lot of the time, this fighting, this battling played out a little bit differently. It's not always a pitched battle. A lot of times it's like the Cold War, where you had very, very brief periods of fiery, savage combat and conflict, followed by small periods of peace. However, these international powers did not want to rest during those times of peace, but they also didn't want to tip their hand and allow their enemies a little bit of leeway. But again, they couldn't fight without having or causing an international incident, and that is where pirates and privateers came in. Many of the pirates, in fact, we're going to be talking about today, and many pirates just in general, got their start as privateers and would either stay privateers or constantly flip-flop between being a licensed privateer for a maritime power to becoming an unlicensed pirate. This, in fact, happened all the time, with some of the most successful pirates of all time also being some of the most successful privateers of all time. Massive shocker. Now, this is, of course, important for us to know because these individuals, part of the reason they were able to gain the opportunities that they were, part of the reason they gained the skills that they had, was because they were willing to engage in that violence, but they were able to engage in that violence with the tacit approval and financial support of world governors. Essentially, they were assets of plausible deniability for massive maritime powers all throughout the region, and most pirates had at least several parts of their crew that either were privateers, were going to be privateers, or were currently in the act of being a privateer while being a pirate. That experience carries pretty much throughout all of the research that I did, which I thought was kind of interesting. And finally, the last piece of kindling on the fire of piracy is that this was a time with a frankly stupid, ridiculous, absolutely befuddling amount of money. This kicks off when the Spanish, of course, find gold in the New World. This gold trade and the trade of gold and silver mines, by the way, pieces of 8, the classic pirate doubloon, this is a misconception that did not get its own section, were not actually always made of gold. Usually they were made of silver, large chunks of silver, but precious metals and the mines that produced those precious metals kicked off a massive amount of wealth in the New World for the Spaniards. This massive influx of highly tradable wealth that was basically worth pretty much the same, if not more, depending on where you took it, what port you went to. There wasn't a lot of haggling. Gold was gold, necessarily. A lot of nations were running on the gold standard or something close to it. Meant that there was not only massive warfare, not only an opportunity to engage in that warfare for plunder at the legal excuse of a national power, but in order to do so, you had ready access to highly portable and incredibly valuable resources in the form of gold and silver. Now, this is not the only currency that helps to kick off the Grand Age of Piracy, but it is the first, and arguably it is the one that lights the fire of piracy during this time period. This is what builds our powder keg of pirates, right? It is maritime warfare, a need for plausible deniability, and a frankly flabbergastingly dumb amount of money that could flow into the hands of anyone with the cutlass and the know-how to take it. But it's important for us to talk about this because gold brings me to the first misconception about pirates as a group. You see, while gold and silver, shining coins, and wonderful doubloons of dubious quantities do help to kick off the golden age of piracy, they are by far and away not what continues it to go for as long as it did. During this time, the colonial powers needed a great deal of goods to help support their maritime interests and to help keep their colonies afloat. This included things like rum, wood, sugar, and ultimately, unfortunately, people. This is where I'm going to again encourage my game masters to, if you're going to use these types of concepts in your games, to lean on those safety tools, or at the very least have a conversation with your players before you spring something like actual human slavery on them into your games. Because during this research, well, I would love to tell you that every single pirate was somebody who, may have engaged in murder, but didn't engage in robbing somebody of their agency in the form of slavery. However, this is not the case. Pirates, much like many of their contemporaries, seem to fall into those three camps of individuals who just try to tacitly ignore the practice of human slavery, those that fought against it, and there were pirates that fought against it. It was actually really interesting to read accounts of pirates from what would be modern-day Gabon and Côte d'Ivoire, or the Ivory Coast, who actually did fight against and burned slave ports, slave ships, freed slaves. It was kind of a cool thing to read about, the fact that there were some pirates who were like, hey, I'll engage in a lot of plunder, just not this kind of plunder, which was kind of neat. And there, of course, were some pirates who did engage in slavery, whether it was the African slave trade, as we know it to be, or in basic chattel slavery of grabbing, kidnapped individuals and selling them into indentured servitude, usually on sugar plantations or to wealthy homes in the New World. Again, this is something that we can't continue our discussion on pirates without talking about. It is a massive part of pirate history because, again, it was a massively profitable part of trade at this time. But again, if you're going to lean on the historical aspects of things, please do not spring this on your players without at least having that conversation first. Because while it is a major part of pirates as they were historically, I don't necessarily think it should be a major part of your games, at least not without a real and honest conversation with the people that you're sitting around the table with. But again, it does bear mentioning, and it also bears mentioning because anything of value could be bought, traded, sold, or stolen. And that's where we're going to move away from the things that we think of, tobacco, rum, molasses, sugar, and of course humans, to something as mundane as things like timber, wheat, iron. This map is actually from the Middle Colonies in 1750, as you can well see from the label, but it actually does a pretty good job of illustrating what colonies and colonial powers were looking for to help keep their colonies afloat. One of the things that we actually have to take into account, Spain in particular, liked to do this, Spain would like to ban its colonies from trading with powers that were not Spain, thus keeping ostensibly the profit for itself, and some colonial powers tried to do this. However, what this did was it created a black market for essentially home goods. While it is awesome to think about pirates swashbuckling on the high seas and fighting for gold, tobacco, molasses, rum, all of those classic staples of high-faring adventure, a lot of times these pirates kind of worked like a floating CVS with swords. They would deliver things like food, medicine, textiles, the essentials that people needed to live in these colonies, and they would deliver them for a massive price. This map includes sections of my home state of Pennsylvania as well as my birth state of New York, but South Carolina, actually the Carolinas in general, South and North Carolina, and parts of Georgia and Florida were massive havens for pirate activity during this time period, and their biggest exports to the colonies were these goods. I said they were a floating CVS with swords. That's not an exaggeration. Maybe they didn't carry as long of a receipt, but you know what I mean? It's the essential thing. But yeah, pirates made a very good, very crisp living, essentially selling you the goods that you would buy from your local Walmart in the modern era. I think that's pretty neat, but it's a major misconception when you're talking about those pirates. Another misconception is the idea that pirates would live these high-flying lives of glory, retiring with their massive amounts of wealth and their ill-gotten gains. And the truth of the matter is, that is not the truth at all. Your average pirate did not live very long, and in fact, they lived a life that was brutish, brutal, and short. I could not corroborate this number, but a lot of anecdotal sources that I found during my research suggested that the average age of a pirate is about 2 years, and that actually sounds about right when I corroborated it with some of the stories of major important pirates. This fine individual right here is Black Bart Roberts, who we'll be talking about later in this presentation. Black Bart Roberts is one of the most successful pirates in the Western world. His career spanned about 3 years. Blackbeard, who you may well know as one of the most infamous pirates of the golden era of piracy, had a career lasting, you guessed it, about 2 years. These individuals generally tended to die violent deaths, and for the most part, rare was the pirate who retired with money in their account. More importantly, though, it's not just greed and violence that gets a pirate. You were as likely to die of things like starvation, drowning, scurvy, and shipwrecked. Those are all major causes of a pirate passing away, as opposed to something like dying in glorious combat against the fleet. Again, this is important for us to take into account, but again, disease, malnutrition, and by the way, another fun fact, a lot of the sailors, both in the traditional navies and in these pirate fleets, could not swim, which meant that drowning was a huge problem. I don't know why swimming was not seen as a major part of this curriculum. Maybe they assumed that, like, hey, if you're gonna wind up in the middle of the ocean, you're probably cooked anyway. Why would we bother to teach you how to swim? But again, all of these are ways that a pirate could pass away. It's important for us to take into account the majority of the pirates. Yeah, you might die a rather violent death, but a lot of the times you might just die of dysentery, like some sort of weird ocean-faring version of the Oregon Trail. Also, unlike bandits, if you watched our video on bandits, I talk about how personal charisma doesn't necessarily matter so much to a physical bandit gang, that bandit gangs were in many cases alliances of convenience and opportunity, and the idea of a charismatic bandit leader isn't something that actually comes up in the historical record. Nothing could be further from the truth when it comes to pirates, where personal charisma mattered a metric ton. There's a number of reasons for this, but the ones that I narrowed down doing the research for this video come down to a couple different things. The first is reputation. A pirate's main goal isn't to destroy, it isn't to unalive, it's to get plunder. And if you could convince people to surrender a ship without a fight, that meant that you were far more likely to take a bigger payday than if you had to battle for it. Blackbeard, for example, was pretty notorious for cultivating an image of terror. It's part of the reason that he tied burning pitch into his beard. But it's essential for him to cultivate a reputation where people are more likely to surrender the goods to him rather than fight to the death for those things. It also helps in keeping your crew alive, because another reason that personal charisma matters falls down to something like geography. We'll talk about that in just a second, but I also want to mention that reputation cuts both ways. This is Calico Jack Rackham of Cuba. Now, Calico Jack Rackham had the opposite reputation. He used his personal charisma to become well loved, not just by his crew, but by individuals in the ports that he visited and the places that he did business. This reputation of joviality, of enjoyment, of excitement served him well because people wanted to please Mr. Rackham. They wanted to be around him. Think of like the popular quarterback in high school kind of trope for Mr. Rackham. This personal charisma allowed him to cultivate better business interests and also a couple love interests. Again, we'll probably get to some of that later. But geography is the big reason that you might want to cultivate a cult of personality on board your pirate ship. Bandits can choose to leave because, let's be real, no one is going to stop you from walking unless they do so at the business end of a musket. However, if you don't like your gang and you're in the middle of the ocean, where are you going to go? And more importantly, if you're the leader of a pirate group and your gang doesn't like you, where are you going to go? You're in the middle of the ocean. Thus, it was important for pirates, particularly pirate leaders, to cultivate their charisma and their personality to make themselves as magnetic as possible. Thus, they would be able to be more readily followed and more readily respected by their counterparts when there were no other immediate options other than walking the plank, which, as trumped up as it is in modern media, did happen a couple times in maritime history. Something to consider. Now, One more thing as well, the reason that you might want to do this is part of the reason that you could maintain order on a ship is if you went AWOL on the ship, if you staged a mutiny, you would be hunted by the state. Now, this meant that there was a looming threat, a stick to go with the carrot of payment, as it were, stopping you from, potentially running roughshod all over your commanding officers, or in the case of the pirates, your captain. You don't have the threat of state violence if you're a pirate captain. All you have is the dint of personality, and I think that matters quite a bit. Now, finally, we have to talk about the idea that pitched battles mattered most. And here's the thing. I know I mentioned this with Blackbeard and the idea of surrendering a ship. That was a common tactic. But again, it gets trumped up in the movies, right? People love the idea of the massive boarding action, of pirates fighting and swashbuckling across the deck, of cannonballs going off everywhere, of masts splintering out in the sky and wood raining down as our heroes fight villains on board the decks, culminating with the capture of a ship and the ending of its captain in dramatic fashion. This is, of course, pretty far from the truth. Pirates were violent opportunists, but they were also shrewd business folks. Destroying a ship meant that you could not add it to the pirate fleet. Destroying a crew meant they could not be ransomed, sold, or recruited into your own. Sinking a ship meant losing the loot that was contained therein. Thus, many pirates, favored the idea of a nighttime ambush, or a clandestine boarding of a ship, or intimidating the captain or the crew of the ship to give it up to them in exchange for their lives and safe passage. All of these methods meant that a pitched battle was actually the last thing that an experienced pirate captain and an experienced pirate crew truly wanted. Again, if people already surrender and you get your paycheck, you don't have to worry about catching a musket ball between your teeth. You've managed to get your payday without risking your peg leg. I think that's an important thing for us to consider, and it's something that modern movies have done a pretty terrible job of truly painting as important in the pirate lifestyle. Which brings us to my next misconception, which is the idea that pirates were always of swarthy British stock. If you have been watching or paying attention to modern pop culture, you may be faced with the Jack Sparrow. Jack Sparrow! That did not sound like Jack Sparrow at all. That sounded like Ringo Starr did a ton of ketamine and decided to join a pirate vessel. But the idea holds the same. You are probably familiar with somebody of a vaguely British-sounding accent, and that makes a ton of sense. Historically speaking, there were quite a few British, Irish, and Welsh sailors. This came from a number of different things. The British Royal Navy was the largest and perhaps most prominent navy in the world at this time. It also featured a practice called impressment. That is something that was the reason that the ranks of the British Royal Navy were swelled by. So impressment was essentially a practice where individuals could get money for every person that they recruited, in air quotes, to join the British Royal Navy. What essentially happened, though, is that you had gangs, literally press gangs, roving around the city, roving around areas of London, or in some cases the countryside, clubbing people unconscious or drugging them, dragging them onto a ship, and then collecting a bounty for having this person being formally recruited into the British Royal Navy. This especially hit rural areas in Scotland, Ireland, and Wales particularly hard, but it also hit urban centers like London. And because of this, you had a navy that, while on the surface, often touted the high quality of its marines and soldiers, its sailors, but in reality was manned by captured people, ne'er-do-wells, debtors, poor individuals, the homeless, individuals who had been totally and completely disenfranchised by their way of living. And this meant that those individuals were looking for an opportunity to escape, to get even, and to make money. They'd already essentially been told by the state that their lives, their freedom, their choice had zero value. And so, as a result, they decided to turn to a life of crime. It made sense. But the reality is that there are so many pirates from so many different sections and segments of civilization, and some of them were far more successful and far more dangerous than their European counterparts. One of the ones that we have to talk about are the Berbers, which are a host of pirates from the Muslim caliphates of the world. They specifically did a lot of damage to the coastlines of Italy, and in some cases sailed up as far as Norway and Iceland, which is absolutely crazy. It's really interesting, at least for me, because these pirates treated both the craft of piracy and the battle of shipcraft as totally different things. While pirates did not want a fight, they would be more than certainly willing to engage in one, but most Berber pirate fleets, quote unquote, and I use the word fleet there loosely, it's doing some heavy lifting, like think groups of 5 to 6 ships, would completely and totally disengage from the first sign of a fight. They were far more interested in raiding and pillaging when there was zero competition or battle. Another thing for us to take into account, other than the difference in skirmish, is a difference in attitude. These pirates viewed their work as mostly a religious jihad, a floating jihad, so to speak. A way of sort of striking back against European powers that had been impressing and going against them up until this point since the Middle Ages, and that actually plays a really big reason. While the European powers, for the most part, totally and completely discounted the motives, the methods by which these individuals engaged in piracy, the caliphates that sponsored them, the people that on these crews, religious motivations were a pretty common characteristic. But the biggest thing to talk about when we're talking about the Berbers is the importance of slavery. This was a group for whom slavery was not just a part of it, but a cornerstone of their trade, and the Berbers were notorious for taking and treating human lives with far more callousness than even their regular counterparts in both Europe and China. Although all pirates did seem to engage in the trade of human beings, the Berbers seemed to make it a cornerstone of their work. But pirate fleets extended to places like China as well, which engaged in both the largest amount of pirate fleets and in many cases the most successful, both in terms of monetary gain and in the longevity of their pirate crews. These individuals would sail in massive fleets on ships called junks, which were usually defined by that large central sail that was essential to steering the ship, but also they would essentially fight in massive fleets. Far different than the 5 to 6 ship fleets of European or Muslim pirates. This is really interesting, at least for me, because these pirates were so successful, they wind up being a massive part in the global order. And interestingly enough, they had a very different golden age. So pirates in China did not really hit their stride until the mid-1700s, and that extends to the late 1800s. Partially, that was due to advances in shipping. Partially, that was due to the opening up of international trade, and ultimately, it was due to training from a very different state. Some people often take into account that these are mostly Chinese pirates, but the truth of the matter is that many of the most successful, well-armed, and well-trained Chinese pirate crews received their training from the Vietnamese, particularly the Vietnamese emperors and empires of that time period. This is a really interesting thing because they are essentially acting as privateers against the world on behalf of the Vietnamese state, which I think is really, really intriguing. Again, huge to talk about, but these pirate fleets in China were massive, well organized, and well armed, and were far more willing to engage in battle than their European or Muslim counterparts. And I think that's ultimately one of the cool takeaways. One of the things I didn't realize until I started doing the research for this video, but pirate tactics are widely varied. European pirates seem to thread that line of wanting to engage in an easy fight for an easy fight's sake, but still being willing to duke it out when honor or necessity dictated that they do so. The Berbers didn't want anything to do with fighting for the most part, preferring hit and run tactics and running away at the first sign of trouble, whereas these Chinese pirate fleets with their formal military training, massive amounts of armor, well organization, and massive numbers were more than willing to throw down with established, well-trained militaries whenever they wanted to. And it's so interesting to see how these different societies and different cultures approach the nature of piracy. And while they may have come to it for similar reasons, they approached it in wildly different ways. And it's just one of the reasons that I think both history in general, pirates in specific, but also just it's part of the reason why I draw that cultural illusion every single time where I tell you that other cultures and other time periods are worth interacting with. If I had only stayed with my understanding of European pirates, I would have totally missed a facet of pirate culture and pirate technique that I would never have known about. And I think that's really fascinating. So again, if anything else, this is your signal to venture beyond your ballywicks a little bit to other time periods and other cultures that maybe exist outside of them. It can be pretty useful, and in my case, it can be incredibly interesting. This was super cool to learn about and to read about those different things. And finally, let's talk about the things that I think are really interesting about pirates, pirate culture, and also just prominent pirates that deserve to have their own section. No conversation of historical pirates can be complete without talking about Jing Yishao, who is a Chinese pirate queen. Her name literally means wife of Jing, who was the pirate captain that she married when she was in her early 20s. Now, what makes Jing Yishao so interesting, at least to me, isn't just that she was a female pirate captain. That was certainly a rarity, although European pirates like Anne Bonny did exist and did have some amount of success and notoriety during the golden age of piracy. It's not just that she's a female pirate, it is the level of success and power that she had. When her husband fell ill and died, or was actually killed in battle, I should say, and then her second husband died, she inherited the command of his fleet. And boy, oh boy, did Jing Yishao do quite a bit with that fleet. By the way, in case you're wondering the level of strength that this woman was able to bring to bear, 400 ships, estimates are a little bit fuzzy, but it's anywhere from between 40 to 60k in terms of the number of pirates, and she commanded 24 of those ships and roughly 1,200 to 1,500 pirates under her personal command, and she treated them like her own personal army. Jing was, by the way, a force of nature in this region, able to defeat not just the Chinese Imperial Navy, but having a pirate career that culminated by crushing the Dutch East India Trading Company. That is flabbergasting how powerful that is, in pitched engagement no less. This isn't just like a small skirmish, this is a full-blown, honest-to-God naval battle that she won against, at the time, one of the preeminent colonial naval superpowers. That is absolutely staggering and totally incredible. Most people are starting to come around to her legend, to her historical accomplishments, but again, far fewer than I would like, at far slower of a speed than I would like, and so I have to bring her up right now. Ultimately, I think her most impressive accomplishment is that she was able to retire with all of her wealth and die at the tender age of 68 during the colonial age of piracy, a far cry from the average life expectancy or career of 3 years that most pirates enjoyed. So not only did she have longevity, but she also had success, massive acclaim, and did so against tremendous odds. It's an incredibly impressive career for a professional privateer, something that I really enjoyed if we're going to talk about her in any way, shape, or form. A pirate that is somehow getting more properly rated, but is still underrated, I think, in our pop cultural understanding and appreciation of pirates in general. However, I do think it really, again, want to bring this up when I'm talking about this, because some people are going to be like, oh, it's only the Dutch East India Trading Company. Yeah, this is an overall map of what the Dutch East India Trading Company was involved in case there's always like one or two weirdos who are like, well, actually, it wasn't that impressive. No, it was incredibly impressive, very dangerous, and kind of shocking, the level of strength and ability it would take to overthrow and completely bring someone like the Dutch East India Trading Company to the negotiating table. But for that individual who I know is going to comment in the comment section anyway that it wasn't that impressive, this is the level of global power and network and reach that Jing Yishao was up against. So yeah, it's staggering. It's actually totally and completely bonkers. We do have to talk about my personal favorite pirate, which is Black Bart Roberts. That's right, Black Bart Roberts, a man who started his career as a pirate in the most ignominious way. He was a navigator aboard a British naval vessel, was not super thrilled to be there, and then was summarily captured by pirates. He did not like being captured by pirates, did not think he was going to be involved in piracy for very long. However, eventually his captain was taken out during an ambush, and the other pirates summarily elected him pirate leader, pirate king, so to speak. What happens then is a 3-year reign of terror, villainy, and utter and complete swagger. This man dressed to the nines. He is probably the reason for 90% of our pirate tropes. He would dress in long, crimson, luxurious silks, gold jewelry, draped pistols, and a sword, as well as diamond-encrusted jewelry, some of which he stole from the King of Portugal. We'll talk about that in just a second. But this man had swagger and charisma to the nines, and essentially just decided he was like, screw it, we ball. If I'm gonna live, I'm gonna live. But if I'm gonna live, I'm gonna do it on my terms and die on my terms. One of his biggest accomplishments was sacking the Portuguese settlement of Príncipe, which he destroyed. By the way, that's the place that, got rid of his pirate captain formally. He also sacked a Portuguese treasure fleet, stealing jewels, custom-made crowns, necklaces, and a diamond and affixed crucifix that had been specially made for the King of Portugal, which is absolutely insane. By the way, a little interesting tidbit about Black Bart Roberts: he died in battle wearing a jewel-encrusted crucifix. I could not find if this was the same one that he stole from the King of Portugal, but it's kind of badass to think about a man who stole jewels from a royal thing, died fighting against another royal navy, wearing the jewels that he lifted from a separate royal navy. I think that's kind of amazing. This one was actually commissioned because he hated the people of Martinique, and I forget the other place, I think it was Barbados, but essentially this is an apocryphal flag. We're not sure if this actually existed, but it was interesting because originally he was like, I'm gonna get a flag, and it's gonna have me standing on the skulls of people from Barbados and Martinique. I think that's pretty amazing. Really, really interesting for us to consider, but this man led a series of professional raids all up and down the Atlantic, the Pacific, and even going as far up to Nova Scotia, which is really, really crazy. Again, we already talked about him stealing jewels from the Portuguese royal family, but really interestingly enough about Mr. Black Bart Roberts, two really interesting things. One is the Pirates Code that often gets talked about in modern media. One of the best and earliest examples of this, which is funny because Black Bart Roberts' life occurs during the end of the golden age of piracy, is from Black Bart Roberts' ship, and it reads kind of like a modern constitution. It essentially pulls out the rights of the crew, what is and is not permitted on the ship, and it not only affords every crew member an equal say in what they're going to do, but an equal share of essentials, so in which case there's food, clothing, and strong liquor, as well as a relatively equal share of the plunder. People like Black Bart Roberts and the quartermaster were to receive 2 shares of each treasure, regular officers 1.25 share, people like the boatswain would have received 1.5 share, and if you were just a regular crew member, you could expect 1 share, which meant that your quote-unquote pirate CEO really only made double what you did. But Black Bart Roberts, because of his infamy and his success on the high seas, that's part of the reason the pirate code has become enshrined in popular media. And another thing I'd like to consider is that as Black Bart Roberts' career kind of continues, he upgrades his ships. He begins with a ship that he calls Fortune. He takes a better ship that he renames Good Fortune, and then by the time that he kills the governor of Martinique and takes his flagship, they rename it to Royal Fortune. So it's kind of like a weird demented pirate Pokemon evolution. I thought that was pretty cool. Another thing for us to consider, however, is that pirate ships are some of the first true Western democracies. Now, at the time of the Grand Age of Piracy, America does not really exist. It brands itself as a land of opportunity, but realistically that isn't the case. There is quite a lot of the caste structure and social hierarchy from the old world that follows the colonists over into the new, and as a result, those opportunities are fewer and farther between than colonial pundits might have wanted people to believe. But pirate ships really truly were the first democracies in many cases. Every person usually had an equal say, or at least a say, in how the ship was going to be run, where the ship was going to go, and what the ship was going to do. By the way, really interestingly enough, Black Bart Roberts' pirate code includes a form of social welfare for individuals that were sick or injured during the course of their voyage. I'm not actually joking. That's ridiculously crazy. So when people are like, hey, we shouldn't provide for the sick, the elderly, and those who need it, Black Bart Roberts was like, actually, we're going to take treasure out of the general coffers to pay for people who are injured. And if you're horribly injured, you get this much. And other stuff will be assigned as needed, which is a wild thing to think about. But these pirate ships were, in many cases, some of the first true Western democracies. That pirate council from Pirates of the Caribbean is not actually so far from the truth. It's far less dramatic and far less, dripped out, so to speak. I don't know if it would have ever been an international council of pirate lords, but pirate meetings and pirate courts were not totally and completely uncommon. I really also want to talk about the greatest hive of scum and villainy, Rhode Island, a place that actually originally was called Rogue Island here in the United States. It was called Rogue Island because this was a place of actual true opportunity in America, in the New World. You want to talk about a state that was willing to give anybody a second chance? It sure as heck wasn't Virginia. It was Rhode Island. Rhode Island was notorious for allowing pirates, smugglers, brothel workers, ne'er-do-wells, and anyone who wanted a second chance to come there, to the point that they were allowed seats in government. Part of Rhode Island's wildly democratic streak that has continued today starts during the golden age of piracy, and it's part of the reason that Rhode Island has sort of continued to keep that sort of rebel, ne'er-do-well sort of spirit. I can't believe I'm saying that, but like some of these governors, or at least some of the staffs of these early colonial governors, were former pirates and criminals, which is kind of crazy. It's really interesting. By the way, this is an apocryphal story. I could not verify this with sources, but the first constitution of Rhode Island is said to have been drawn up on a sandbar that was usually routinely used to stash illegal rum for smugglers. I, again, couldn't verify that, but that's a pretty common story that I heard a couple times. Take it with a grain of salt. I'm warning you that it's apocryphal right now. But again, it just goes to speak about the importance of these individuals to democratic development, not just in the United States, but in the New World in general. And one thing that I want you to think about is that pirates could take missions for any reason at all. But sometimes, gosh darn it, you took a mission for the boys. I want you to look at this beautiful place of beachfront property. This is Charleston, South Carolina, a wonderful home away from home. It's where a lot of retirees are going nowadays in the year of our Lord 2025. But at the time of Mr. Edward Teach, it was an important pirate haven. Not only was it important, it was incredibly lucrative and profitable to the British government and to the early American colonies. So much so that when Blackbeard was hard up for cash, he blockaded the settlement. That's right. One of the first, essentially, terrorist attacks on the United States comes from Blackbeard, who kidnapped several officials from South Carolina, besieged the port, blockaded the port, and raided it of its sundry goods and services. Why did he do this? Because he needed to afford venereal medication because a couple of his boys had gotten STDs while going through a series of brothels in Cuba. That's right, folks. One of the largest, most successful, well-coordinated pirate attacks that ever occurred during the golden age of piracy happened because they didn't wear condoms, and Blackbeard was such a homie, he was like, hey, not gonna let that happen to my squad. And so, rather than try to find medicine any other way, the dude literally besieged the colonial government and took their money. I told you they were basically floating CVS's. I was not joking. It is wild to think that pirates, with all of their freedom in the world, still manage to find time to engage in dangerous, wild, and incredibly difficult tasks just because the homies needed it. And I think that is well and truly amazing. And finally, I do want to draw one more piece of attention and interest for those of you who want to make pirates a part of your games. Deck-to-deck combat is vastly different historically than it is portrayed in popular media. I'd like to draw your attention to this picture of Captain Hook, who is using a cutlass, quote unquote. Look how long and grandiose this sword is. In truth, this would have been practically useless on the deck of a ship. You see, cutlasses were just one weapon in the arsenal of a pirate, but they were short-handled and they were short-bladed because usually you would have to use them while climbing up a mast, while swinging over onto a deck, or most importantly, when you're below decks. When you're below decks, there is a limited amount of time and space for you to swing or stab a blade, and as a result, a cutlass needed to be short in order for it to be effective in deck-to-deck combat. Other weapons would have included daggers, knives, and boarding axes. However, the cutlass, as it is known, the most iconic of the pirate weapons, other than perhaps the flintlock pistol, were short, they were stout, and they were made for close confines and even more savage close quarters fighting. If you're going to put swords into your pirate campaign, they need to be short, brutal, and effective, like Mighty Mouse. But now it's time to talk about pirates in our games. And as tradition states, whenever I do one of these fun lore and world building videos, I decide to mix it up a little bit. Usually I put in a bunch of different rules or monsters or characters or items, but this time I decided to do pirate crews. And so here are two very special pirate crews, one that's a little bit more grounded and one that is absolutely batshit insane. So Let's talk about our first crew, and this actually came from a response in the Discord. Someone was asking how dwarves, with their propensity to avoid water, would perform as pirate crews, and I actually think a dwarf is kind of an ideal pirate in a lot of different ways. So let me introduce you to the Grimjaw clan. I envision this as a dwarven society that has actually spread to piracy when their cave structures and homes flooded. They built thin and long ships, kind of like Viking longships, in order to traverse their caverns once the flood happened, and they realized that they were quite effective at doing so, eventually transforming those long ships into something that relies on dwarven technology to make them additionally quick and powerful, but it will allow them to function on the high seas. So if you're going to do this as a ship-to-ship rule, I think they have a lower top speed than most other ships by other navies, but they're able to keep a constant pace and speed regardless of the weather. I also think that they're heavily armored for their size, but that doesn't affect the movement. So what you have is a medium speed ship that is armed to the teeth and is able to keep consistent, which I think is very dwarven in general. But what I really think would make a dwarf an ideal pirate is their size, right? We talked about how cutlasses were effective for deck-to-deck combat, the kind of vicious, close quarters, tight-spaced combat that most pirates would engage in, and I think that's actually what the dwarf would actually be really good at. Their dark vision would allow them to actually continue to fight in low-light environments, like below deck, and their short size, stature, and propensity for working in close quarters anyway, because of where they are from, makes them ideal fighters for below deck military actions. I actually think dwarves would be quite fantastic fighters, particularly if you could get one to sort of transfer their craft from stone to wood. I think a dwarven shipwright would go absolutely crazy. But my personal favorite one, however, combines the sort of floating barges with the kind of alchemical expertise that you find in absolutely insane wizard labs. Allow me to introduce you to Vile Bile Corp. Vile Bile Corp's motto is there are no laws in international waters. I love the idea of an insane group of alchemists essentially creating a floating laboratory, and then that laboratory spewing off its runoff into the ocean, so much so that the Vile Bile Corp is able to employ a series of mutated animals that are around the ship at all times, essentially making small ship-to-ship engagement, or if anybody were to fall into the ocean, probably going to hose them pretty bad. Anybody not protected by, in the water gets damaged every single turn. And if you really want to spread this out and make it more interesting, I think you could also create these as individual mini-bosses or as harder engagements for your players, depending on the system that you're running. But in a nod to one of our Discord moderators, Ironbones, one of the things Ironbones mentioned was the idea of a troll catapult in one of our earlier videos of throwing basically chopped up troll flesh in the process of regenerating into a stronghold and having that actually evolve into a troll to attack the defenders. I liked this idea, and I decided to take it one more step further into the realms of insanity. If you've ever watched The Prestige, spoilers for The Prestige in about 2 seconds, you'll know that the magician in that movie creates a sort of duplicate of themselves and then murders the duplicate in order to complete the magic trick. And I thought, what if we took this principle of the Prestige, the insanity of the troll catapult, and we applied them to the Vile Bile Corp? You see, the Vile Bile Corp isn't held aloft by basic principles. No, its shoddy, shabby floating laboratory is actually not seaworthy at all. It is held up by an ever-growing, constantly drowning mass of regenerating troll flesh. That's right. The Vile Bile Corp decided that what was the best way to keep themselves afloat? It was the constant extinguishing of thousands upon thousands of troll lives every single second. This means that you have an insane barge, a constantly sinking barge, held up by thousands of dying pieces of regenerating troll flesh, encircled by mutated, hopped up, ketted up sea creatures, and manned by a bunch of alchemists who only came to international waters to avoid legal consequences. I love the Vile Bile Corp. Please put them into one of your games. And obviously it goes without standing, but yeah, the only way to really sink the boat is to actually manage to burn or incinerate the constantly regenerating troll flesh that surrounds the boat. There's a lot that you can do with this as a GM, but I think this idea is both absolutely insane and would make for a really interesting campaign. Certainly one that your players might never forget. But with that, my good friends, it brings us to the end of our video. If you liked the time with us, again, all of the YouTube pleasantries go a long way, but if you'd like to really support us and you like the nautical theme, why not pick up a copy of You Have Always Lived in the Lighthouse, our 2-player GM-less role-playing game. You can get digital copies by following this QR code or just checking us out on itch.io, and physical copies from links in any of the parts of the description below. Exalted Funeral and Indie Press Revolution will hook you up with those copies post haste. But until next time, I am Kyle for Desks and Dorks. As a reminder, we're doing our Q&A section, and if you want to be a part of the next Q&A, all you have to do is join the Discord. But the Q&A section is coming up next, but if this is where we part ways, I just want to let you know, thank you so much for watching. You've all been absolutely amazing, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace. Hello, Dad Bod. We did it. We got through another one. That is pretty freaking great. Hello everyone, and hopefully you're here. If you want to be part of the next Q&A, join the Discord. Obviously, if you've never watched the Desks and Dorks video, the Q&A section is pretty informal. It's not really edited. It's more conversational as I go through and I answer questions that you may have asked me that I did not actually manage to get around to. So, let's talk about it. Chris Bates asks, what is the difference between a pirate and a privateer? I think we covered this pretty well, but it's essentially a privateer is somebody who pirates for money and gets a national license to do it. So think of them like an extrajudicial soldier or agent of a nation state. What is a letter of marque? That is essentially the contract that a state draws up. If you're a Warhammer 40k person, the charter of like a rogue trader is very similar to this. How do I get one? You have to be rich and born several hundred years ago. And do pirates ever have the same ghost crew as other ships? Widows men, i.e. those who were not reported as being dead, so they could split their pay between the crew. That's actually interesting. I couldn't find anything quite like a widow's crew, Chris, but it doesn't seem so far-fetched. A lot of the pirate charters that I read and pirate contracts that I read seem like the pirates really did care about making sure that their friends, allies, and compatriots managed to get a fair cut of the profit, a fair cut of the proceeds. So, could be useful. When are you going to play Pirate Borg with me? This is from @SaltyNick, who then proceeded to say it in the video, you coward. Well, Salty Nick, as soon as the release for Fear Within is done, I'm not going to lie to you guys, this has been a really stressful release cycle for me, for reasons that maybe I'll get into, maybe not, at some point, maybe like further down the road, but there's a lot that's kind of been going on behind the scenes that I have sort of been trying to like work my way through with the release to make sure that everybody gets the game that I think they deserve. And because Fear Within is a fantastic system, it's a fantastic game, and it's one that I would like to have be the best game that it possibly can be. And so this has been a really stressful release schedule for me. I'm not gonna lie, but as soon as that's done and my life settles down at least a little bit, yeah, then I would like to play Pirate Borg with you. It is actually at the top of my list of games to try with people this year. So yeah. Then Chris Bates asked, did pirates have a priority list when landing at port like other sailors? Yes, absolutely. And actually, Chris provides a list right here. Pawn shop to sell everything, pub to get drunk, house of ill repute and soft beds, a jail, pawn shop, back to sea. It's actually not entirely inaccurate, actually, which is pretty great. Was the Royal Navy ever more than a legitimized bunch of pirates? I would say they were worse than a legitimized bunch of pirates because in many ways, the British Navy at various points in its history was not held up by legitimate naval soldiers. They're held by people who've been press ganged into service, which was actually worse. At least the pirates wanted to be there, which is pretty sweet. So yeah, I would say that the British Navy is actually a step below pirates, which is kind of crazy. Shockingly enough, the guy who believes that, people should have universal basic rights and income and like healthcare is not a fan of the state strong-arming the poor, the destitute, and the homeless into fighting wars they have no interest in fighting. Weird how that works. The Adjudicator, my main love for an avenue into the world of pirates comes from Pirates of the Caribbean, Curse of the Black Pearl. It's a great film. Were there any real documented pirate curses like Ob's the Curse aren't real, but I mean the belief by anyone? Tons. In fact, we could probably have done a whole video, Adjudicator, on pirates being real, but I'll tell you, they're pirate adjacent, but there's a lot, but like Mind Your P's and Q's and Bottoms Up were both British drinking suspicions, like superstitions, because there were some press gangs that would slip coins into your drink, and if you drank the drink and the coin, you reached the coin, they were like, you have accepted the king's pay and now we can press gang you into service. So that was something. Again, it's an apocryphal story. I don't know how true that is, but pirates were a vastly superstitious lot, right? Symbols of death and all manner of misfortune were a large part of the pirate motif, because sailors, I think, in general, are a superstitious lot. Like, if you've ever watched The Lighthouse, the idea of the albatross being something you don't want to hurt is a real deal. So, yeah. I think those are all pretty good examples of it. But, yeah. Lol, don't make me get all political. It's already late. We've already gotten political. As somebody once said, they're like, stop putting political takes into your videos. And I was like, all of history is political, and also no. Fusty Dog asked, what was naval combat like pre-gunpowder in the Middle Ages? Were there weapons/methods to sinking an enemy ship at range, or was it mostly based on around boarding actions? It's a really great question, and probably one that will be getting its own video at some point. So weirdly enough, the medieval navy is at a time of transition, so there were a lot of boarding actions, yes, but there was quite a lot of also like ranged combat necessarily, right? Like you have like ballista, or like not ballista, scorpions, I think are what they're called in antiquity, to be like anti-personnel weapons on board ships. You also have things like Greek fire throwers on board ships, and like there's a first-hand account of Hannibal Barca after he loses the Second Punic War, basically being hired by by the Seleucid Empire to help fight the Romans, and he devises a catapult that throws asps onto the decks of ships to sow chaos. So a lot of cool stuff. I mean, that's antiquity and the Middle Ages, but like, you know, there's a lot of cool stuff that happened pre-gunpowder. Luke Birch asked, how do pirates make do during periods of either low shipping volume or frequent heavy protection? This is a phenomenal question. It's absolutely a real legitimate thing. So some pirates turned bounty hunter or privateer. Some pirates just quit the life entirely and started to do work. Some died, just like literally just spent the majority of their fortune at places of ill repute and then just couldn't shake off the debtors, or just like literally debauched themselves into an early grave. So like, yeah, that all happened. In terms of like frequent heavy protection, eventually piracy gets too frequently heavily protected and it just dies out as an industry. At least the golden age of it dies out. There's obviously still pirates around today. Shout out to the Smallies. Is the idea of frequently having a telescope or spyglass in fiction based in reality? Sort of. So a spyglass is still very expensive. Depending on when within that 1600s to 1700s window that we're looking at. Some ships would have had them and they would have been precious, like absolutely precious. One of the few things that D&D got right in its earlier editions, like I'm thinking of 3.5, is that like if you want to buy a telescope, it's like 1,500 gold. Which is insane for like low level parties, but it's worth it because like of the expanded vision. That's pretty close to like the small fortune it would have been worth, because again, like glass manufacture, particularly refracted glass, which you need for the lenses, would have been difficult, but eventually it becomes not a big thing. It was far more common, Luke, for more ships to have compasses, astrolabes, and charts to sort of map their stuff out. So how did pirates reliably locate ships to target? That's pretty easy. The shipping lanes as they were sort of well established, right? Like people knew where you were going because like you had to sell those goods somewhere, and usually you sold them to the colonies or to Africa or to England. And so you had a really good idea in general of where ships would be going. And so usually you could capture charts from other ships. You could bribe captains or bribe other officials to find out more. But in general, Luke, there was a pretty good, there's a pretty good thing. Why is the most feared thing at sea actually fire? Chris Bates asked this. The big thing is, I think if you're on board a ship, I don't know if fire is as scary as scurvy. I know, like, I don't know. Fire, because in general, like, you couldn't swim. We talked about that in the video. But, yeah, in general, really, really scary stuff, because if a fire broke out on the ship and you didn't control it, you were just hosed. But I don't know if it's the most feared thing. It's definitely as scary as... I don't know if it's as scary as scurvy. Scurvy might be my one. Carl, why is the rum always gone? Because we like to party. That's pretty much it. Chris Bates, but what about the rums? Again, we like to party. Actually a huge deal. Twin Steel asked, what is my favorite pirate flag? My favorite pirate flag belongs to Blackbeard, which he had a pirate flag that's like basically a skeleton holding a spear, and it looks like it's going to plunge the spear into a human heart. I think that one's really great. Bartholomew Roberts or Edward Teach. As a pirate, I think Black Bart Roberts takes it. He's one of my favorite pirates. He's probably my favorite pirate. As a person, Edward Teach is actually kind of the GOAT. So there's recent findings that came out, and I will try to find the links to the article that I read in the description that came up that Edward Teach might have been a mulatto, might have been which I don't know if that's a politically correct terminology anymore, but was of mixed descent. That his father was a British naval officer, and that his mother may have been a plantation worker from Jamaica. And so, but apparently, according to most sources that knew Edward Teach, he was passing as like a white person essentially. And so there's some really cool firsthand accounts and firsthand sources of Teach essentially leaving his inheritance to his illegitimate brothers and sisters who were not passing, because he was like, I'm going to go pirate anyway, and this is the only legitimate income you'll probably get to make, which was pretty cool of him to do. So yeah, that's like recent too. That's like new stuff that's been found within like the last year and a half, 2 years, which is kind of crazy. But yeah, Teach apparently kind of the GOAT. Favorite fictional pirate, Edward freaking Kenway, baby. I love Assassin's Creed. It's Edward Kenway. Like, I mean, come on. It's an assassin pirate. Like, that's so cool. Best pirate idea for dwarves, given their purported fear of water. You were the one that inspired that monster section in Twin Steel, so I hope you enjoyed that one. So you have a whole dwarven pirate crew to potentially enjoy. Carl makes stuff. Again, if you have not checked out Carl Makes Stuff, you guys should. He does phenomenal work. I'll throw him a shameless self-plug because Carl's the GOAT. How much of the golden age of piracy knowledge is actual history versus whatever we managed to scrape off a general history of pirates? A mix, to be quite honest. A general history of pirates is so interesting because I mentioned this in the video, but like pirates were mythologizing themselves and people were mythologizing pirates even during the golden age of piracy. It's very much like the Wild West in that respect, in that regard. So a lot of it does come from that, but like, these were people who, like, there were so many folks that knew, like, Black Bart Roberts was, like, a popular person, which is crazy. So, like, you know, I don't doubt that there's quite a lot of embellishment that, you know, a general history of pirates does. But, you know, I think there's a lot more of it that's true, which is crazy. Like Zheng Jitao managed to, like, retire and die at 68, like, and we know that she did because she legally had holdings in China, massive holdings. Like, it was cool. So, Chris Bates asked, how much of pirate knowledge is actual Hollywood versus created history? Weirdly enough, with pirates, it just feels like it's a, in general, kind of mix of both. There's a lot of stuff that, like, Hollywood doesn't go far enough with, and some of the stuff that it goes too far with. So, weirdly enough, I would say, Chris, it's like 50-50, which is kind of crazy. The Yar being one of those, as Carl rightfully points out. But yeah, which is cool. So apart from the absolutely magnificent bastard Henry Morgan and the absolutely magnificent bastardess Zhang Yishao, were there any other individual pirates who got big enough to be a geopolitical problem? Black Bart Roberts. Black Bart Roberts was a geopolitical problem. There is a fascinating read that I did, particularly when I was talking about pirates and slavery. But Black Bart Roberts slowed down slave trade in Africa so badly it stopped during his 3-year reign. Not a joke. He literally basically rendered that whole leg of the triangle trade essentially moot. For like, I don't think it was for the full extent of his 3 years, because obviously he wasn't in Africa for all of it, but probably about a year, maybe a year and some change, which is insane. So yeah, Black Bart Roberts did a thing. And like, I want to talk about Black Bart Roberts a little bit now because like, he's a complex figure when it comes to slavery. So when Black Bart Roberts was killed, 93 people in his crew were emancipated slaves that Black Bart Roberts had personally freed, that's kind of a big deal, right? Like that's, you know, when we talk about the moral complexity of a character like Black Bart Roberts, like that's a huge deal, right? The 93 of them, and they were serving as equals on his crew. Like this wasn't like some pity stuff. This was like, no, like you're a full-blooded member of Black Bart Roberts' crew, and they were loyal to him. And from most accounts, he was loyal to them. And so like, that's interesting to consider. But then like you read about the fact that like Black Bart Roberts captures a slave ship and then they refuse the ransom, and rather than emancipate those slaves, he just burns the slave ship and kills like 80 some Africans on board that slave ship, right? So it's so interesting. I don't know, the moral complexities of some of these characters, these people, right? Like, and I calling them characters, I think does this a disservice, right? But the moral complexities of people like Black Bart Roberts are so intriguing to me, because like clearly he didn't like slavery, but he was also willing to treat Africans like chattel. And so I don't know, like, and again, ultimately my opinion doesn't really matter so much, because like, I don't know if you all know this or not, but like, I am the same color as Wonder Bread. So like, how I feel about it probably doesn't matter too much, but it's hard to take all of this into account, right? Because like, part of me wants to praise Black Bart Roberts, a guy who literally stopped the global slave trade for a year and some change, and fought side by side as equals with emancipated slaves. But then he does stuff like that. I don't know. It's hard. Again, it's difficult. It's difficult to gauge that moral complexity. Apprentice Salesman asks, why did otherwise ordinary people who hadn't had a history of crime or clear motives become pirates? He's like, I already know the answer generally, but it is a useful question. It is. And we did mention in the video, but it's economic opportunity and freedom, right? Like, you were stuck in a time where your life was worth basically less than the clothes on your back or the clothes the Navy provided you. You were unlikely for any sort of social mobility or greater economic mobility, and then instead you just firmed it and you became a pirate. I think it's awesome. McGeal asks, considering the East India Company's monopoly on the world, were there any Robin Hood-esque pirates that were out to support a bigger community, or were they exclusively out for themselves? Bellamy was literally called Robin Hood, but I don't know if he was noble like that. I think it's much like Black Bart Roberts and slavery. I think it's a far more complex issue, right? I think many pirates saw themselves as having a cause or having a code, right? Like, Black Bart Roberts is a scumbag, but the code that he drafts for his men is, by all accounts, something he actually lived and abided by, which is kind of crazy. And it's hard for me to judge those people. So I think on some level, McGeal, even the pirates who were quote unquote out for themselves, I think did see themselves in some way, shape, or form as agents for this sort of greater social change. Again, I can't speak to that with any authority because, you know, we have primary sources and we have anecdotal records and we have, you know, the biographies and we have a history of pirates and all that other stuff. But like, you know, unless we get a time machine and we're able to like talk to them about all of this, we can't really know where their heads were at. But I don't know, Blackbeard giving up his like family holdings to his siblings and then basically spending a year just like taking it out on the rich seems kind of, I don't know, it seems like it might be something. I would be shocked if some of them did not have that in mind. I think that's a big deal. So Masked Bandit asked, who is likely to win in an anachronistic battle royale of top pirate captains, not counting modern pirates with RPGs and without calling for help, etc. If it is a 1v1 fight, right, I think Teach takes it hands down. I don't think there is a better single person fighter than Edward Teach. I really don't. I really, really, really don't. The dude from all accounts was an absolute freaking unit on the battlefield. I mean, just he was shot like 4 times and kept fighting. Like, he was nuts. Now, granted, these are like lower level firearms, but still, like, the dude was walking around with musket balls and pistol balls in his chest and was still slogging his way through it with a sword in each hand. That's crazy work. In terms of like a fleet to fleet battle, as much as I like Black Bart Roberts, I don't think he is quite as good as a fleet to fleet commander as Henry Morgan or Zheng Yi Chao is. I think either one of them would take it. It just depends, I think, on who is able to get the greater mobility initially. My leaning is Zheng. I think she would probably take it just because she went up against the Dutch East India Trading Company and the Chinese Navy, and just like, you know, mercenary armies and like all this other stuff. So she wasn't fighting against slouches. Neither was Henry Morgan. I think it's high diff. If I'm being honest, it's definitely a high diff fight. But if we're going like a fleet to fleet battle, I think Zheng takes it. If you're just like throw the pirates in physical combat, it's Edward Teach and it's not close. I don't think it's close at all. I think he just dog walks most of these people. Just absolutely insane. Also, what is the best way to get into maritime piracy now? I saw a retired submarine for sale. You probably don't want to do that. Most piracy is not protected by the Geneva Convention or international law, so maybe don't do that. But this is where I get to tell you a fun anecdote, whereas like Pepsi at one point had like the 8th or 9th largest navy in the world because Russia couldn't pay for like their Pepsi order, essentially. And so Pepsi wound up with like a bunch of decommissioned nuclear subs and a couple destroyers. So Pepsi could have had a pirate fleet at some point. So, which is pretty great. The Adjudicator asked, where does the myth surrounding women not being allowed in pirate ships come from? And are there any known women pirates or crew?
Was there any commentary from others about what people thought about women pirates, if there were women pirates? There were plenty of women pirates. Anne Bonny, Mary Read, obviously we mentioned Zhang several times. So like there's a bunch of very prominent, very important female pirates. And it wasn't a superstition. I think it was just out of practicality. Literally practicality. Like no joke. So in Black Bart Roberts' pirate code, he says that like anybody who brings a woman onto the ship and disguises her and like knowingly does it gets marooned. And I think truthfully they were just trying to avoid the kind of interrelational problems that come when you're in that sort of quarantine stressed environment. And like you have that thing happen. I don't think it was a superstition. I think it was actually practicality. Weirdly enough, before we start, dogpiling onto the male pirates, Zheng Yichao's fleet had the same rule. And that was her imposing that rule, which was crazy. Weirdly enough, both Black Bart Roberts and Zheng Yichao's rules specifically protect the women in that circumstance. The woman was supposed to be brought back to port by Black Bart Roberts. The guy was the one that got marooned or shot, essentially. And Zheng Yichao has the same thing. And actually, Zheng's rules included caveats for if a man forced himself upon a woman. That punishment was horrific. So, like, I think it was just a matter of logistics. Now, granted, if you were like an Anne Bonny or a Mary Read, it doesn't matter. You just crush. Like, who's going to stop you? Like, literally, Anne Bonny and Mary Read both dual-wield boarding axes and are better fighters than 90% of the men on that ship. Like, what are you going to do? Like, I'm just saying, like, the two of them were terrifying. Like, so, I don't know, just in general. And Alien Dragon pointed out that, like, the lion's share of them came from male-dominated areas in that history, which is very true, right? Like, the majority of naval people were supposed to be guys at that thing. And as Carl points out, actually, most of the guys wouldn't get stabby over courting privileges, and gambling on board was strongly discouraged for that reason. Yes, although Black Bart Roberts' pirate code includes lines for rum and clothing and food to be provided to the men at equal charge, gambling and dice and cards were all banned. He did, however, because apparently he was not a total Philistine, gave extra rest days to the musicians on the ship, which I think is kind of neat. And with that being said, that brings us to the end of our Q&A section. Again, hopefully you all stuck around this long for the Q&A. As always, it's an absolute pleasure to have you all here. And if you want to take part in the next Q&A, all you've got to do, get to the Discord link in the description below. You can join the Discord. As a reminder to those of you going to the Discord, maybe a week after this video goes live, the links to the Discord always expire after about 7 days. It's a safety gap I put in, essentially, so like, in case like a bad actor or something slips through the cracks, they can't always go back to like the older videos. It just kind of lets me keep the pace on the Discord at a more reasonable rate, I think. And that might change at some point soon, but if you're listening to this after that 7-day period, that's probably why. Well, my voice is officially shot, but this has been an absolute blast and a half. Thank you all so much for being here. I really mean it. This has been one of the more fun videos for me to do, so I really hope you all enjoyed it as well. But until next time, Kyle out for Desks and Dorks. You're all absolutely amazing. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.